I didn't realize the lazy whir of the box fan in our living room that Thursday morning would be the last ordinary sound before my life tilted on its axis. I was slouched on the second-hand sofa, flipping through a dog-eared trail guide, when Mason padded in from the hallway, tossing a rolled-up climbing rope onto the coffee table. He flashed the easy grin that always turned my thoughts warm and restless. The one that convinced half the neighborhood to join his weekend adventures and, in weaker moments, convinced me that maybe friendship could be enough. I'm the kind of person who catalogs silence how it changes shape when someone walks into a room. Mason's presence filled every corner. The cedar scent of his aftershave, the soft scuff of his hiking boots, the low chuckle he gave when he noticed the pile of granola bars I'd lined up like soldiers. My roommates in college called me precise. Mason calls me methodical, as if the word is both a compliment and a private joke. He plucked a bar from the formation and held it up with a teasing arch of his brow. 6 hours on the trail. Jamie, not 6 days, he said. It's an overnight trek, not a stroll, I replied, feigning indifference while my pulse misbehaved. Having him close always felt like balancing on a narrow ridge, thrilling, terrifying, and strangely freeing. We'd been living together for 10 quiet months in this drafty apartment above the bakery, sharing everything from the scorch marks on our mismatched pans to late-night sci-fi marathons that bled into dawn. On paper, we were opposites. Mason, the spontaneous outdoor junkie who forgot half his gear yet always made it to the summit. Me, the graphic designer who color codes gear lists and feels anxious if a battery drops below 50%. But somewhere, between coffee runs and midnight conversations about favorite album covers, our differences threaded into something that felt suspiciously like home, at least to me. Our upcoming trip to Granite Ridge had started as a casual invite. Mason had burst through the door one evening, eyes bright with the kind of excitement that turns words into momentum. Let's get out of the city this weekend. One last climb before the semester starts, he'd said, tossing me the faded brochure he'd fished from the climbing gym. I'd said yes too quickly, caught off guard by the possibility of uninterrupted time alone with him, time where the world might slow down long enough for me to understand what I wanted, and whether wanting was enough. Now, watching him cross the room, I noticed things I never said aloud. The way the muscles in his forearms flexed when he cinched his pack straps, the faint birthmark near his collarbone, like a hidden constellation peeking above his t-shirt. He caught me staring and grinned again, unaware of the confession beating in my ribs. You're spacing out, man, he said, snapping his fingers gently in front of my face. Visualizing the view already. Just running through the checklist, I lied, sliding the trail guide into my bag. The guide's cover, a faded photograph of 2 climbers silhouetted against a bright horizon, felt suddenly prophetic. I wondered if, by the time we returned, the silhouette beside me might look different, closer. Mason grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. I'll gas up the Jeep and grab an extra headlamp. Meet you downstairs in 10. Got it, I said, watching him leave. The door clicked shut, and the apartment exhaled its emptiness. I pressed a palm against the cool wood, letting myself feel the seismic shift of anticipation. Tomorrow we'd be high above the city lights, alone with the wind and our own secrets. I couldn't decide if that thought thrilled me or pulled the ground from under my feet, but either way, the climb had already begun. ***, when Mason and I first met. It wasn't exactly some epic spark moment. It was a Craigslist ad, a handshake, and a shared disdain for overpriced apartments in the city. He showed up at the coffee shop wearing a faded Yosemite or Bus t-shirt and ordered the sweetest iced drink on the menu, then raised an eyebrow when I asked for black coffee. I remember thinking, he's either going to drive me nuts or become the most interesting part of my week. Turned out it was both. He moved in 3 days later, bringing little more than a duffel bag full of camping gear, a pair of worn-out climbing shoes, and a tragically large collection of socks with holes. I offered him the larger bedroom. He took the smaller one because, as he put it, I like being close to the fire escape, in case of alien invasions. We laughed, but he meant it. Mason had a knack for making everything sound like an adventure, even laundry day. Over time, our friendship became its own quiet rhythm. Saturday mornings meant walking to the corner bakery, where I'd get a blueberry scone and he'd convince the cashier to give him extra icing on a cinnamon roll. Sunday evenings were reserved for what he dubbed sad movie rituals. We'd sit on the couch, half wrapped in fleece blankets, and cry in dignified silence over whatever film had the most devastating IMDb summary. He never made me feel weird for being quieter than him. Where Mason filled space with stories and laughter, I filled it with presence, listening, noticing. He'd rant about his boss at the climbing gym or talk about some trail he wanted to hike, and I'd just watch him with a kind of soft envy, wondering what it felt like to be that free. There were signs, of course, moments that didn't quite fit in the friendship box. Like the time I was sick with a stomach bug and he brought me 3 kinds of soup because I wasn't sure what your comfort flavor was. Or the night the power went out and we played cards by flashlight. He let me win. I knew he let me win. And when I called him out on it, he just smirked and said, "You needed a win today." Sometimes I caught him looking at me too long, or maybe I was the one looking. It's hard to tell when you're the only one keeping score. Still, I kept a lid on it. That's what you do when your straight roommate makes your heart beat faster every time he walks into the room. You tell yourself you're lucky just to be near him. There was this one night that changed the temperature between us, even if neither of us admitted it. We were in the kitchen after midnight. He'd just gotten back from a late climb and was still buzzing with adrenaline. I was making tea, bleary-eyed in pajama pants, when he walked in shirtless, sweat still clinging to his chest. He opened the fridge, then paused like he forgot what he came for. I said something dumb about protein shakes. He laughed. Then he stepped closer, close enough to notice the freckles across his collarbone, close enough that I felt the warmth of his skin before I realized I was staring. He didn't move away, just looked at me for a second too long, something unspoken, tugging at the edge of his expression. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment slipped away like it never happened. Since then, things have been the same but not quite. He started doing these small things, brushing against me when we passed in the hallway, leaning in when we shared a screen, letting silence stretch just a second longer than it used to. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if he was testing some invisible boundary neither of us had acknowledged. And then came the trip plan. Granite Ridge was supposed to be a group thing, 4 of us, all regulars at the climbing gym, but slowly, one by one, the others dropped out. A pulled muscle, a sudden shift at work, a niece's birthday party. Suddenly, it was just me and Mason. When he texted, "Still down to go, just us." I stared at my phone for 5 full minutes. Just us. I typed yeah and erased it 3 times before hitting send. That night, I couldn't sleep. My brain kept rerunning every shared look, every shoulder bump, every accidental graze of fingers. When we passed the remote, part of me wanted to believe he knew, that maybe somehow he felt it too, but then I'd remember the stories he told about past hookups, all of them girls, the way he'd nudge me when we passed someone cute on the street, just to see if I'd noticed. Maybe he thought he was being a good wingman, maybe he was just being Mason. Still, there was this feeling I couldn't shake, like something was slowly unraveling between us, thread by thread. And now, with the trip just hours away, I knew one thing for sure. There wouldn't be anyone else around to fill the silence, and I wasn't sure I could hold it in anymore. Granite Ridge looked gentler on the brochure, clean lines of granite slicing into a perfect sky, but by late afternoon the real thing loomed like a shipwrecked cathedral. We had the entire north face to ourselves. The other camp permits were still fluttering from dashboards down in the valley. Mason set the Jeep's handbrake beside the single dusty pullout and killed the engine. The sudden hush felt too intimate, like the moment in a song when the drums drop out and you hear your own breathing. We geared up in practiced silence, him slinging cams and quick draws across his chest, me fussing with carabiners until their clinks formed a nervous metronome. I kept waiting for the rest of our group to materialize, even though I knew every RSVP had evaporated. Just us. The words still felt combustible. "Sun's dropping faster than I thought," Mason said, shading his eyes toward the ridge. "We'll bivvy at the halfway ledge, finish the route at dawn." "Good, sure," I answered, hoping my voice sounded steadier than my pulse. A night halfway up the wall meant sharing a one-person ledge, barely wider than a bookstore armchair, shoulders pressed together, nowhere to look but at each other or the stars. I swallowed. Yeah, good plan. Granite under my fingertips was rough as unpolished glass. Every crack and nub felt alive, humming with the risk of a misstep and the promise of weightlessness. Mason led the first pitch, moving with wolfish confidence. From my belay stance, I watched his muscles flex under sun-bleached fabric, each reach a silent conversation between body and stone. At the anchor, he called off belay in that bright voice that always made strangers trust him. I started up, grateful for the excuse to focus on footholds instead of feelings. Halfway through the second pitch, a raven swooped low, its shadow streaking across the rock face. Instinctively, I flinched. My foot skated. My fingers slipped. Rope cinched tight Mason's reflexes, saving me before the gasp left my lips. "You okay?" His shout drifted down, laced with concern that folded into something gentler. Just slipped. I rested my forehead against the granite, forcing slow breaths. Get a grip, Jamie, on the rock. On yourself. When I finally topped out beside him, he didn't gloat or tease, just tapped my helmet with 2 fingers, a silent, "I've got you," and began arranging the next anchor. The casual gesture hit harder, then a hug. We reached the halfway ledge as dusk painted the valley in gold dust and violet. The shelf was smaller than I remembered, a slanted stone balcony fenced by nothing but airy space. Mason unclipped the portaledge from his haul loop and flicked it open with practiced snaps, creating a flimsy little platform barely 3 feet wide. "One deluxe suite with cliffside view," he announced. "5 stars, I muttered, trying to sound amused instead of terrified. I clipped myself to the anchor, then we shuffled onto the nylon cat, knees bumping. There was nowhere for our gear except in our laps, and nowhere for our feet except tangled together against the rock. The proximity felt electric. Every place our bodies touched sparked questions I wasn't ready to ask. A sliver of moon rose. Wind skimmed the cliff, lifting Mason's hair so it brushed my cheek. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pointed out into the violet haze where the first evening star blinked awake. "See that?" he whispered. "Saturn, I think." "Venus," I corrected quietly. "Saturn's lower this month." Mason smiled, the expression softening his whole face. "Knew you'd have the answer." The compliment was casual, yet it settled warm and dangerous behind my ribs. I looked down at our boots, dusty, touching at the toes. His knee nudged mine, not quite moving away. Heat pooled in my chest like sunlight through glass. When the last of the daylight slipped away, Mason reached behind him for the small stove, intent on boiling water. A sudden clang echoed as the fuel canister slipped from his fingers, bounced once, and vanished into the darkness below. We both froze. 80 feet of air swallowed the hiss of metal on granite, then silence. No spare fuel meant no hot dinner, no warm drinks, and more pressingly, no coffee for Mason in the morning. He blew out a slow breath, cheeks puffing like a frustrated cartoon bear. "Well," he said, voice pitched lighter than the situation warranted, "guess we're going minimalist tonight." I tried for humor. "Gourmet menu, lukewarm protein bars." "Table for 2, he replied, rolling his eyes, yet the set of his shoulders betrayed a flicker of worry. "Night tang at Granite Ridge could dip near freezing." We had our shared emergency blanket, but it would be tight. "Switch to plan B," I suggested before I could overthink it. "Shared body heat. High-tech solution." The words left my mouth too quickly, and my ears flooded hot. Mason's laugh was soft, "You and your methodical plans." He unfolded the metallic blanket, spreading it across our laps like a quilt, then zipped our down jackets together into one wide cocoon. "Necessity," I told myself. Still, the brush of his hand against my ribcage as he adjusted the zipper felt anything but utilitarian. Moonlight silvered the ridge. The world beyond our ledge dissolved into shapes and shadows. Yet inside the blanket everything was unnervingly clear, his thigh warm against mine, our shoulders wedged together, the faint rise and fall of his breath. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The hush was full of possibilities, most of them reckless. My thoughts looped. If I lean my head against his shoulder, does it count as survival strategy? If he notices my heartbeat, will he pretend he can't? A tremor, part chill, part nerves. Through me, Mason felt it. I sensed him glance sideways. "Cold?" he asked, voice low, a little. Truth, I was blazing. Without ceremony, he lifted his arm and draped it across my shoulders, drawing me closer so my temple rested against his chest. His t-shirt smelled like pine resin and chalk dust. My pulse skittered. I waited for him to shift away or crack a joke to diffuse whatever this was, but he simply exhaled a deep, contented sound that reverberated through his ribs and into my cheek. 1,000 questions crowded my tongue. "Do you feel this too? What would happen if I turned?" And I swallowed them all. Changing our friendship felt like stepping onto loose grease. One wrong move and everything could slide. Yet Mason kept his arm there, absent-mindedly tracing patterns on my upper arm with his fingertips. The touches were so small they might have been accidental, but each one mapped a new territory of longing. "Thanks for coming up here with me," he murmured, words almost lost in the wind. I attempted breathing. Wouldn't miss it. He turned slightly, enough that his chin brushed my hair. "You never do," he said, like it mattered. An affectionate squeeze followed, brief yet deliberate. I stared out at the starlit void, heart hammering. The boundary between necessity and want blurred with every centimeter of closeness. I pictured morning, the climb, the summit, the long rappellers strapped to the same rope. Trust was physical out here. If I confessed and everything crumbled, I'd still be tethered to him on the descent. The thought chilled me more than the night air, but Mason's fingertips kept circling gently, unintentionally or intentionally raising the question he hadn't voiced. The ridge was silent witness to a conversation happening entirely in touch and withheld breath. My eyes drifted shut, not from fatigue, but from the dizzy terror of possibilities. Inside the blanket, 2 heartbeats tried to synchronize, failing, over and over like musicians tuning before the song begins. And above us, constellations wheeled on, charting a sky so wide it made every risk seem both infinite and suddenly aching. I woke at first light to the rasp of nylon and Mason's quiet cursing. Our blanket had slipped in the night, letting high-altitude chill bite the seam of our jackets. He was already half out of the cocoon, fingers stiff as he packed the stove we never used. For a moment I watched the dawn wash rose gold over his profile, soft stubble, wind-chapped lips, the stubborn lock of hair he could never tame. Warmth rippled through me and panic followed, because sunrise meant climbing again. Climbing meant focus, and focus was impossible with every nerve tuned to the person at the other end of my rope. "Morning," he said, forcing brightness into the word. "Morning," I managed, sitting up. My shoulder tingled where his arm had rested. The absence felt louder than the wind. We ate cold protein bars, chewing in silence, broken only by the hiss of our breath in the thin air. When he finally met my eyes, something flickered there, an unasked question, maybe the same one hammering inside my skull. But he looked away, tightening his harness instead. The climb resumed. Granite, chilled by night, bled warmth into our fingertips as the sun rose. Mason led again, and I belayed, trying to let muscle memory drown the clamor of what if, what if, what if. Around us the world sharpened into blue sky and glittering mica. Below, the valley blurred to watercolor. Halfway up the pitch, he paused at a crux, searching for purchase. His left hand slipped, sending a spray of grit across my face. "Got you," I called, locking the belay. He hung for a breath, legs trembling. "Thanks," he panted, voice raw, then softer. "Nice to know someone's looking out for me." The words landed with more weight than the rockfall. By the time he found the next hold and continued, my palms were slick, not from fear of the height, but from what waited between us when feet finally touched level ground. We topped out just before noon, stepping onto a flat expanse no wider than a living room rug. Beyond the ridge, mountains rolled away in dusty blue layers. To the east, the city shimmered like a toy model. I unslung my pack and let the wind dry sweat from my neck. Mason walked a slow circle, arms lifted in silent victory, then dropped, to sit on a sun-warmed boulder. For once he didn't whoop or joke, he just stared at the horizon. I eased down beside him, every movement rehearsed to avoid accidental touch. It didn't matter. The space between us buzzed as if charged by static. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Yeah." My voice rasped. I wasn't looking at the view. He dug into a pocket and produced 2 crushed yet miraculously unbroken chocolate biscuits. He offered one with a crooked smile. "Breakfast upgrade." I laughed, tension cracking like thin ice. Our fingers brushed in the exchange. Brief spark, quick withdrawal. He stared at the ridge again, jaw working as though turning over words. Finally he said, "I was scared back there." Soft, like it cost him the slip. "You handled it." "That's not what I mean." The wind died for a second, leaving only the thud of my pulse. "Then what?" He opened and closed his mouth, laughed under his breath. I keep rehearsing how to say this, but every version sounds risky. The biscuit crumbled in my hand. "Risky how?" He dragged a thumb across his lower lip, one of his tells when he was nervous. "Jamie, I know I joke about aliens and bad coffee and everything, but when things get serious, I don't always have the right words." "You can try," I whispered. He looked at me then, really looked at me then, really looked. Eyes the color of wet stone, shining with something fragile. When we were wrapped up, I wasn't cold anymore, but I didn't want to move, because it felt he swallowed. It felt right, and that scared me more than the climb. A tremor shook my chest. "Mason, let me finish." He exhaled, breath hitching. "I've spent my life sure of one thing, who I fall for, and it was never." He gestured. "Between us, I keep telling myself it's the altitude messing with my head, but then I remember all the little things. Bringing you soup, watching you sketch trail maps at 3 a.m., the way you pronounce escarpment like it's a secret password. They replay on a loop, and suddenly I'm questioning everything I thought I knew." Time slowed, then snapped. "Forward." I set the ruined biscuit aside and wiped crumbs from my palms. "So what are you saying?" He laughed again, helpless. "That if you lean 6 inches closer, I might forget how scared I am and do something that changes us forever." My throat closed. Sunlight glinted off the carabiners at his hip anchors, dependable metal answers. If only feelings came with the same failsafes. I spoke before courage failed. What if I've been hoping for that change since the day you moved in? His intake of breath was sharp. Jamie, I tried to bury it. Told myself friendship was enough, because I couldn't risk losing you. But last night, with your arm around me, I stopped being afraid of the fall and started being afraid of the ground, of going back to pretending when we got home. Mason's eyes glistened. You're not pretending now. No. The air smelled of sun-warmed lichen and something like relief. I'm terrified, but I'm not pretending. He reached out, then paused inches from my cheek, waiting for permission. I leaned forward the missing distance. His knuckles brushed skin. Sparks leapt like static, but softer, sweeter. His hand cupped my jaw. Tell me if this is too fast, he murmured. It's exactly the pace I've been waiting for. I breathed. The kiss landed featherlight, testing, as tentative as the first reach onto unfamiliar stone. Warm lips, a shaky exhale, the faint taste of chocolate. The world didn't tilt or explode. It simply aligned, pieces slipping into place with the certainty of a finished climb. When we parted, his forehead rested against mine, close enough to feel the stutter of his heartbeat sync with my own, still slightly out of rhythm but always trying to find harmony. I don't know what this makes me, he whispered. Human, I said. And mine, if you want. His answering smile was unsteady and brilliant. I want. We packed for the rappel in gentle silence, broken by shy glances that now carried weight instead of tension. Yet under every exchanged carabiner and double-checked knot, new fears lurked. How does this shift translate to ground level? What will tomorrow look like between dishes and rent and movie nights? Halfway down the longest rappel, Mason paused. At the anchor ledge, waiting while I unclipped to join him. The narrow perch forced our harnesses to touch, hips aligned. He steadied me with hands on my waist, deliberate, not accidental. You okay? He asked. Better than okay, I said, pulse thrumming where his thumbs traced circles through jacket fabric. His gaze softened. For the record, I'm still scared. Me too, but I'm also sure. He squeezed lightly. If we can trust each other with ropes above 1,000-foot drop, we can figure out the rest. I couldn't help smiling. Trust and chocolate biscuits. Our relationship pillars. A laugh burst from him, bright, unfiltered. He leaned in and pressed a quick kiss to my temple before we returned to the task. The gesture was small, but, for me, it eclipsed any sunrise I'd ever chased. When our feet finally hit valley soil, the first thing Mason did was tangle our fingers. No witnesses, no distractions, just the crunch of gravel under boots and the lazy buzz of insects. He lifted our joined hands, studying them like some new piece of gear. This feels weird, he admitted, thumb stroking my knuckle, but in the best way. Good weird, I agreed. He opened the Jeep, tossed in packs, then hesitated beside the driver's seat. Jamie, yeah, just don't let me chicken out when we get home. I traced the curve of his wrist with my free hand. That's the thing about being roped together, I said gently. If you run, you'll only drag me with you. A grin curved his mouth. Guess I'd better stay, then. He squeezed my hand once. Wins, promised, and climbed behind the wheel. I folded into the passenger seat, heart settling into a new, steady cadence that felt suspiciously like belonging. The road unspooled ahead, shimmering in midday heat, leading toward a life we hadn't mapped yet. But for the first time, uncertainty didn't feel like a void. It felt like open sky. He started the engine, glanced over with a spark of playful challenge. So, about those hole-filled socks, think you could help me shop for new ones? I laughed, leaning back as the Jeep rumbled forward. Only if you promise to color-code them. Methodical, he teased and added, softer, and mine. The tires kicked up dust, mountains shrinking in the rearview, but the tether between us stayed taut, invisible, unbreakable, and somewhere in the hum of wheels and wind, I realized the summit hadn't been the top, it was the beginning of the trail. The first true mark on a shared map. Whatever came next, we'd climb it together. The highway back to the city felt shorter than it ever had. Maybe because Mason kept reaching across the console to brush his fingers along the inside of my wrist. It wasn't bold enough to distract him from the road, just a soft reminder that the cliffside promise we'd made hadn't vanished with the altitude. I traced tiny circles on his knuckles in return, our own private language as the Jeep 8 miles. Beneath a washed blue sky, we stopped at a gas station cafe for caffeine and the world's worst microwaved burritos. Standing in line, Mason slid behind me and rested his chin on my shoulder, voice low. Do you think iced coffee is a valid post-summit celebration, or should we aim classier? I tilted my head toward him, catching the faint scrape of his stubble. Considering we celebrated last night with lukewarm protein bars, I'd call this an upgrade. He bit back a grin and whispered, "Fair point. Still, next climb we deserve at least French press. Look at you making future plans already. Try and stop me." The exchange felt effortless, yet charged a replayful jab, a thread pulling us closer. At the register, Mason ordered for both of us without asking, like he'd always done, but this time he added a chocolate brownie to the tray and nudged it my way. "Payment for heroic ballet work," he said. His wink shot a warm tide through my chest. Stopped back in the Jeep. We talked about nothing and everything. Music playlists, favorite route names, how chalk leaves ghost white fingerprints on steering wheels. Halfway through a story about his first failed attempt at Granite Ridge, Mason grew quiet. He drummed the wheel, searching for courage he'd already proven he had. About earlier he began, eyes flicking to mine before returning to the road. "I keep thinking I should be freaking out more. You know, identity crisis, existential dread, all that. Are you?" I asked. He exhaled. "I'm surprised, but I'm not panicked. Mostly He glanced over again, lips tipping into that crooked half smile. "Mostly I'm excited and kind of relieved. Relieved. I've spent months wondering why hanging out with you felt different than hanging out with anyone else." His thumb tapped the wheel in rhythm. "Now I know. It's terrifying, but it also finally makes sense." My pulse stuttered at the word months. "You could have said something." "I tried," he said. "Remember when I asked if you ever thought about who you'd take on a desert island?" I laughed. "You made me choose between a barista, a YouTuber, and my college calculus teacher. Not exactly a declaration of love." He blushed. "Yeah, well, subtlety isn't my strong suit." "Good," I said, and rested my palm on his thigh, feeling muscle tense, then relax, because I'm done with subtle, too. The city skyline appeared, and with it, the ordinary details of life, rent checks, climbing gym shifts, my looming design deadline. The closer we got to home, the louder the practical questions fluttered in my head. How would we tell friends? What if the apartment felt smaller now that touching was allowed? What if touching wasn't always enough? Mason parked behind the bakery and turned off the engine. Afternoon heat spilled through the windshield, dust motes swirling. He leaned back, head against the seat. "So, rules, he hummed. "Guidelines. Maybe we live together. If we dive in too fast, it could get messy. It could." I agreed, tracing a line on the seam of his jeans. "But we both know communication is your secret superpower." "My boss would disagree," he muttered. "Fine, your almost superpower." I met his gaze. "Let's promise to talk, even when it's uncomfortable. If one of us feels weird, we say so." He nodded slowly. "Deal, and no sneaking into each other's rooms at 3 a.m. on a work night." "Negotiate that one," I said, grinning. "Maybe weekends are fair game." The grin he returned was pure sunshine. "Weekends it is." We hauled our gear upstairs, trading joking complaints about sore shoulders. Inside the apartment, nothing had changed. The same thrift store sofa, the same crooked bookshelf, but everything felt rewired. As I set my pack down, Mason tugged me by the hip until we were chest to chest. "I've wanted to do this since the summit," he murmured, pressing his forehead to mine. The soft vulnerability in his eyes made the room tilt. I let my hands slide under the hem of his t-shirt, fingers splayed against warm skin. His breath caught. We kissed, slow, exploring, unhurried, until the world narrowed to the quiet click of his tongue ring against my teeth and the gentle push of his heartbeat under my palms. When we finally broke apart, he rested his head on my shoulder, arms looped around my waist like he never meant to let go. "What happens now?" I asked, voice a husk. "Dinner," he said, lifting his head and flashing a mischievous smile. "And then movie night, because tradition matters. Only this time, halfway through the credits, I plan on kissing you again. And after that," he inhaled, serious now, "after that we keep living. We climb, we work, we annoy each other about laundry. But we do it together. We figure it out one hold at a time." I brushed a thumb across his cheek. "Sounds like the best kind of route." He kissed my palm, then stepped back and stretched, muscles rippling beneath sunlit skin. "I'm starving. Pizza. Methodical nutrition," I teased. "Please, you love pepperoni. Because you never eat the crust, I get double." He laughed, that wide free sound that hooked me from the beginning, and grabbed his phone. As he ordered, I unpacked, breathing in the apartment's familiar bread and coffee aroma, anchoring myself to the ordinary miracles of everyday life. The hum of the fridge, the thud of climbing shoes hitting the floor, the knowledge that when the pizza arrived there would be couch space enough for two, and For the first time, no space at all between us. Asterisk, asterisk. The pizza box was nothing but grease stains and cold cardboard by the time the credits rolled. Mason muted the TV, then shifted so our knees brushed on the sofa. He had that half-serious tilt to his head. I'd learned to recognize the look. He got before a hard route or an important promise. Tomorrow's Monday, he said. Real life, I traced the seam of his sleeve. Real life's not so bad. True, he hesitated, then lifted the colorful rope bracelet he'd been knotting while we watched the film scraps from the cord that saved me on the mountain. I made you something extremely professional, he joked, but his voice cracked with sudden sincerity. My chest tightened as he fastened it around my wrist, the tiny fisherman's knot pressed snug against my pulse. Keeps us tied in, he murmured. Whenever we're apart, you'll know the other end's still with me. The gesture simple, handmade, entirely Mason felt weightier than any grand declaration. I curled my fingers around the knot and tugged gently. You're stuck with me now. Methodically stuck, he teased. Eyes warmed. A soft knock rattled the old radiator pipes. Mrs. Rivera, our neighbor, delivering her customary welcome home cinnamon bread. Mason accepted it with exaggerated politeness, then closed the door and grinned. First test, he whispered. Before I could ask, he interlaced our fingers and wandered back into the hall, where anyone in the building could see like it was the easiest thing he'd ever done. My stomach flipped, but no panic came, only a buoyant sort of rightness. We tackled laundry next, gear strewn across the living room floor, chalk dust rising in pale clouds. As I sorted his infamous hole-riddled socks, he pressed a sticker sheet into my palm. Tiny color-coded labels. Figured I'd beat you to it, he said. I laughed so hard the socks scattered like confetti. Something as trivial as labeling clothes shouldn't have felt intimate, yet it did. Every shared ordinary task now carried a shimmer, proof that love doesn't just bloom on summits, but in small domestic corners. While the washer thumped, we sprawled on the hardwood with a cheap city map. Mason grabbed a highlighter. Pick a diner neither of us has been to, he said. Breakfast date before my shift. I pointed at a little star he'd drawn near the river. Too far to bike. We'll take the tram. Gives us more time to people watch. He wiggled his eyebrows. And to decide how we tell the climbing gang. The thought made my pulse skip, yet dread didn't follow. We'll tell them together, I said. Maybe invite them on a route and let them figure it out when you try to hold my hand mid-pitch. His laugh echoed off the bare walls. Deal, but only if you promise not to correct my not terminology in front of them. No promises. The dryer buzzed. We folded in tandem, shoulders bumping. When the last t-shirt was tucked away, Mason caught my waist, spun me half a circle, and dipped me like we were in a cheesy rom-com. We both nearly toppled. Breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. I don't know where I'm going with all this, he admitted, voice low. I just know every plan I make from here on out has your name penciled in. Then pencil me in for the long haul, I whispered. We can ink it later. Night settled outside, city lights blinking beyond the curtains, and fatigue, finally, tugged at our limbs. Mason threaded his fingers through mine and guided me down the hallway toward our rooms. At the fork he paused, eyes dancing with mischief and nerves. Weeknight rule. I brushed my lips against his. Rule can bend. Once he exhaled, a laugh tinged with relief, then led me into his room. We didn't cross any frantic lines. Instead we lay atop the quilt, fully clothed, talking in murmurs about childhood embarrassments, dream climbs, and the perfect brownie recipe. At some point, he drifted off mid-sentence, palm spread over the bracelet on my wrist like he was keeping the promise safe even in sleep. I watched him breathe, moonlight sketching soft angles across his cheek. My mind flicked through looming realities, coming out conversations, potential awkwardness at work, the fragile fact that feelings can evolve as unpredictably as weather on a ridge. Yet fear felt oddly small. We'd already trusted each other with ropes and 1,000 vertical feet of open air. Trust on flat ground suddenly seemed simpler. Just before sleep claimed me too. Mason mumbled, half awake, next summer half dome. I smiled into the dark, and every summit after that. His fingers tightened over mine in wordless agreement. Morning would bring alarms, coffee, and the first test of ordinary life together. But tonight the apartment held a hush as profound as any mountaintop. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled down the avenue. Oblivious to the quiet vow forged between two roommates turned climbers turned, something bright and unnamed. The journey ahead was vast, uncharted, and dizzying, but the rope between us was already knotted, and the first anchor held firm. And so, with our hands bridged by a length of repurposed climbing cord, and a future mapped only in hopeful sketches, we let the world fall away confident that whatever routes awaited, we would meet each overhang side by side, pulling upward together toward the wide open sky.